The first sensation was nothing but pain, a sharp, tearing agony that seemed to slice through every fiber of his being, yet it was nothing compared to the terror that followed. He awoke in darkness, the smell of oil and antiseptic filling his nostrils, a cold metal surface pressing against his back. He could not move freely, could not lift his arms or legs, and the sensation of his own body betraying him sent panic through his mind. They had come in the night, silent as shadows, with no warning, no explanation. One moment he had been in his home, dreaming of the mundane comforts of his small life, and the next, he had been ripped from his bed and dragged into the unknown. He could still feel the rough hands, not gentle but firm, guiding him through corridors that hummed with mechanical life, walls lined with pipes and cables that seemed to pulse like veins. The footsteps of his captors echoed in his ears, and the faint glow of red lights cast unnatural shadows that danced across the walls, mocking his helplessness. At first, he thought he might be dead, trapped between life and death, but the pain told him otherwise. His body, fragile and human, was being examined, prodded, and dissected with instruments that gleamed under the crimson light. They called it a blessing, a sacred process of transformation, but to him it was nothing but horror. Every incision burned, every attachment tore at his flesh, and with every passing moment, a part of him disappeared. Memory, sensation, thought, these were the sacrifices demanded by the machine, by the Adeptus Mechanicus, who saw humans not as individuals but as vessels, raw material for their sacred constructs. They spoke little, their words garbled and reverent, more prayers to the machine god than conversation. Each word seemed to resonate with cold purpose, and he understood quickly that resistance was meaningless. Chains of metal were fused to his limbs, cables snaking into his spine and skull, connecting him to machines that hummed and whirred with unnatural life. His vision flickered, overlays of data and mechanical schematics flashing before his eyes, sensors feeding him information he could not comprehend. It was overwhelming, a flood of stimuli that his human mind was not equipped to handle, and yet they did not stop. Every moment brought new alterations, new enhancements, and new erasures. Fingers were replaced with servos and clamps, muscles with hydraulic actuators, neural pathways rerouted to obey commands that were not his own. Pain was no longer just physical. It became mental, a torment that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. He could hear the faint echoes of his own thoughts, fragments of memory that no longer belonged to him. The sound of his mother's voice calling him to supper, the laughter of a friend in a sunlit street, the small joys of a life that was now impossibly distant, all of it assaulted him in waves, reminders of the humanity that was being stripped away. Every nerve ending screamed as wires and metal replaced what once was flesh. They told him to accept it, that resistance was heresy, that the machine god demanded perfection and obedience above all else. Time lost meaning. Days, or was it hours, passed in a haze of suffering and transformation. They implanted stimulators in his brain to control pain, to suppress instinct and emotion, to ensure compliance. They removed sections of his memory to reduce fear and doubt, replacing them with protocols and directives. When he tried to remember, tried to cling to who he was, his mind recoiled in confusion, fragments of identity slipping through the cracks like sand. Sleep became impossible. Even when unconscious, the machines worked on him, recalibrating, refining, reshaping. The very act of being human became a liability, and they erased it systematically. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, these sensations, once the markers of his humanity, faded into irrelevance. Instead, he felt the cold efficiency of machinery in their place. Hydraulic limbs responded to commands before his conscious mind could formulate them. Sensors recorded temperature, pressure, and chemical composition with unerring precision. Pain was reduced to a signal, emotion to a series of binary outputs, thought to a mechanical calculation. Yet somewhere, buried beneath layers of circuitry and obedience, the faintest spark of awareness remained. It screamed, though no one could hear, a ghost trapped within the shell of metal and wire. The tech priests moved with ritualistic precision. Every operation was a ceremony, every incision a prayer, every connection a rite to the Omnissiah. They chanted in tongues older than the stars, their voices weaving through the machinery and into his mind. Sometimes he thought he heard them speak his name, though when he tried to respond, only mechanical servos echoed back his voice, hollow and unfamiliar. His own speech was gone, replaced with commands that he was forced to obey. To think independently became dangerous, to feel was forbidden. He became a vessel for their will, an extension of the Imperium's industrial might. Even the environment was hostile. The chamber in which he was held was alive with mechanical noise, the hiss of pneumatic pistons, the grinding of gears, the electric pulse of conduits. The smell of burning insulation and ozone filled his nostrils. Shadows shifted unnaturally across the walls, cast by lights that seemed to float in midair. Every corner of the room was lined with instruments of torment and transformation, each more terrifying than the last. When he looked at his reflection in a polished metal surface, he barely recognized himself. One eye had been replaced with a photoreceptor, veins replaced with conduits, skin interlaced with metal plating. What stared back at him was both familiar and alien, a grotesque fusion of man and machine. Memories of family, of laughter, of fear, all became distant echoes, fading with each modification. They implanted subroutines to suppress hesitation, to eliminate doubt, to enforce obedience. When his mind tried to wander, a surge of pain reminded him that it no longer belonged to him. Individuality was a dangerous luxury, and the machine god demanded the surrender of the self. They told him this was salvation, that by becoming a servitor, he would serve the Imperium for eternity. And yet, he could feel the humanity slipping away, leaving a hollow echo in its place, a shell animated by commands and circuitry. The transformation was gradual, yet relentless. Each procedure left marks on his body, each implant a reminder that he was no longer human. The voices in the chamber, chanting and reverent, became the only constants in a world of pain. He tried to scream, to resist, but the sound was hollow, synthetic, lost to the machinery that now controlled his vocal cords. Even thought itself became regulated, pathways in his brain rerouted to prioritize efficiency over emotion, logic over empathy. Yet beneath the layers of metal and obedience, a spark remained, not enough to act, not enough to defy, but enough to remember the horror of what had been done to him. Eventually they stopped speaking to him as if he were alive. He was no longer a patient, no longer a human. They referred to him as a unit, a servitor, a tool. Names were unnecessary, identity was irrelevant. He moved because he was commanded, acted because protocols dictated, and thought only in the structured logic imposed upon him. Sometimes, when the machinery quieted, he could hear the faintest echoes of his past, memories that burned brighter than any light in the chamber. But they were fleeting, snuffed out by electrodes and subroutines, leaving only obedience and the cold efficiency of a machine. And yet, even in the deepest recesses of his mind, a question lingered: who had he been? The answer remained just out of reach, a fragment of a life lost to the Imperium, erased in the service of the machine god. Pain, memory, fear, and hope were all stripped away, replaced with functionality, obedience, and the terrifying realization that he would never be human again. The last thing he remembered before being sent to the factory floors, to the battlefields, to serve without question, was the echo of his own name, a name no one would ever speak again, a name belonging to someone who no longer existed. He had died that night, not in body, but in soul, and what remained was no longer a man, no longer a human, but a servitor, a hollow shell, forever bound to the will of the machine god, condemned to a life of unending toil, pain, and servitude. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was no salvation for him, no mercy, only the relentless, horrifying reality of being a machine with a flicker of a man's memory trapped inside. The first moments of his new existence were a blur of sound, light, and sensation, none of which he could comprehend. The world he had once known, the warmth of sunlight on his skin, the comforting weight of familiar objects, the smell of bread baking, the sound of laughter, was gone. In its place was the constant hum of machinery, the metallic taste of oil in the air, and the cold, unfeeling gaze of eyes that no longer belonged to him. He could no longer feel his fingers in the same way, could no longer flex his muscles or curl his toes without the guidance of pistons and hydraulics. The body he had once taken for granted was now a cage of metal and wire, obedient to commands he could barely understand, responding to stimuli faster than thought itself. He was moved through the halls of the facility, a silent automaton, a creature of flesh and circuitry. The tech priests observed him with clinical detachment, adjusting interfaces, testing neural relays, and issuing commands in voices that blended praise and ritual. He could not respond, could not ask questions, could not cry out. because the very mechanisms that once allowed speech were now controlled by servos and processors. When a command was issued, he moved instantly, precisely, as though anticipating the order before it left the priest's lips. And yet, beneath it all, something remained, an echo, a faint trace of the person he had been, fluttering like a candle flame against the mechanical darkness. Tasks were assigned immediately. Lift, carry, operate, assemble, repair. The specifics mattered less than the obedience. His mind, now partially wired into the facility's systems, received instructions directly as neural impulses, bypassing conscious thought. The transition from instinct to programmed compliance was seamless and horrifying. The first time he attempted to resist, a surge of pain coursed through his neural implants, sharp and electric, a reminder that resistance was not permitted. It was not punishment, it was a safeguard, an integrated command enforcing the will of the machine god. And so he learned to obey, to move without question, to act without hesitation. The sensory changes were relentless. He could see beyond human vision now, detecting infrared and ultraviolet, sensors overlaying data onto his field of view. He could hear the faintest vibrations in the walls, the subtle hiss of steam, the rhythm of machinery within 100 meters. Touch became precise and mechanical. He could feel the torque in a bolt, the pressure in a conduit, the alignment of a gear as though the machine itself was whispering to him. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, all were irrelevant. Where once he had been human, now there was only function, a cold calculation of energy expenditure and efficiency. Yet, every sense carried with it a tormenting memory. The smell of oil reminded him of rain-soaked streets from a childhood long past. The mechanical hums echoed like the voices of friends and family, distorted and unreachable. Even as his mind was reshaped, fragments of feeling lingered. He felt pain when a limb was overexerted, though it was less flesh than metal. He recoiled from loud, sudden sounds as though his human instincts still existed in shadow form. These fleeting residues of humanity were confusing and maddening. They were reminders of what he had lost, of a self he could no longer reclaim. Training was constant. He was shown how to operate complex machinery with precision beyond natural human capability. Conveyors, assembly lines, power generators, weapon systems, all required skills that were implanted directly into his neural pathways. The tech priests monitored his performance, their red, lit eyes scanning his every movement for hesitation or error. When he failed, even slightly, a brief shock reminded him that imperfection was not allowed. Over time, he no longer flinched. The punishment became part of the pattern, a predictable variable in a life governed entirely by control. Interaction with other servitors was limited. Some were like him, half human, half machine, their minds fractured by obedience. Others were fully mechanical, grotesque parodies of what humans had once been, obeying commands without question or flicker of awareness. He noticed the hierarchy among them. Those with more complex augmentations, more neural connections, were treated with greater reverence, used for more critical tasks. But all shared the same fate, the slow, methodical erasure of individuality, replaced by programmed utility. Occasionally, fragments of recognition would spark when a familiar face, or what once was familiar, passed by. But these were quickly suppressed, drowned in the constant flood of commands and tasks. Sleep, if it could be called that, was a state of semi-conscious stasis. Neural regulators forced rest cycles, but there was no dreaming, no respite. During these periods, the tech priests would interface directly with his mind, adjusting memory banks, refining motor control, reinforcing obedience protocols. Each cycle left him less human, more precise, more efficient. Memory fragments of his past, names, faces, feelings, were cataloged, stored, and systematically reduced. He could recall them only faintly, like distant echoes through layers of metal and circuitry. Attempting to dwell on them produced pain, a neurological deterrent to ensure focus remained on function, not sentiment. The factory floor was a world of horrors. Flames, molten metal, spinning blades, and high-voltage conduits filled the environment with constant danger. Human workers had long since been replaced by servitors and machines. Those who remained were often conscripted or broken, their wills subsumed into servile obedience. He was tasked with handling materials too hot, too heavy, or too precise for ordinary humans. Each successful operation reinforced his status as a functioning component of the Imperium's industrial machine. Each failure was punished with pain, recalibration, or the removal of what little autonomy remained. Communication was limited to simple signals. He could emit tones or lights to indicate completion of a task or malfunction, but words were unnecessary. Thought itself was directed by neural implants, language was redundant. Yet in rare, fleeting moments, a question would surface in his mind: who am I? The answer was always inaccessible, blocked by circuitry, suppressed by directives, drowned in the mechanical precision of existence. He began to understand the truth. He had ceased to be a man. He was a tool, a machine with a flicker of human memory, condemned to function without purpose beyond the orders he received. The tech priests continued to observe, their rituals as precise as the instruments they wielded. Every movement, every microsecond of response time, every signal from his neural implants was monitored. Efficiency was worshipped, error was heresy. He learned to anticipate commands before they were issued, to move as though he were the machine itself, a seamless extension of the factory floor. And yet, beneath the mechanical perfection, the ghost of his mind remained. He remembered fear, hunger, fatigue, joy, and sorrow, if only in the briefest flashes. They were painful, bittersweet, and utterly unattainable. Interactions with other servitors were devoid of camaraderie or empathy. Some units malfunctioned and were dismantled before his eyes, metal and flesh discarded in heaps. Occasionally, he would glimpse the remnants of a familiar face in the fragments, and an unbidden surge of horror would pass through him. But there was no time to dwell on these thoughts. Orders came constantly, and the machines required him. There was no comfort, no relief, no escape. Even the simplest tasks became exercises in obedience, adjusting a valve, tightening a screw, transporting materials. Each action was executed with precision dictated by neural protocols, yet each carried the weight of his own obliterated identity. As he moved, as he worked, as he obeyed, he could feel the machinery shaping him, shaping what he had once been into a tool, a servitor, a husk of humanity bound to the will of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Occasionally, he would hear the distant sound of human voices, the laughter or cries of those who had not yet been transformed. For a fleeting instant, longing would flare within him, a spark of recognition that he had once been like them. But the sensation was suppressed, stamped out by implants and pain stimulators. The machine god demanded obedience, not empathy, function, not feeling, existence, not humanity. Time passed, or perhaps it did not. Days, nights, cycles of operation and stasis blurred into one continuous sequence of action. He learned to anticipate the needs of the machines around him, to respond before thought, to act with unerring precision. Tasks that once required attention and judgment were now automatic, embedded in his neural pathways, yet always, beneath the surface, the faintest flicker of memory and awareness remained. He could not act on it, could not speak it, could barely even sense it, but it persisted, a cruel reminder of what he had lost. In this new existence, there was no comfort, no joy, no reprieve. There was only function, obedience, and the constant, unyielding presence of the machines he now served. And yet, somewhere in the shadows of his mind, a question lingered, unanswered and unanswerable. If he had once been a man, what remained of that man now? The answer was unknowable. The past was gone, erased in the service of the Imperium, leaving only the mechanical perfection of the present. He had become a tool, a weapon, a servant of metal and circuitry. But within the shell of obedience, buried deep beneath layers of implants and protocols, the spark of his humanity endured, faint and flickering. It was a cruel irony, a ghost of what once was, trapped forever in the relentless, terrifying reality of being a servitor. Even as he moved through the factory floors with the mechanical precision of a perfected machine, even as his limbs obeyed the commands of the tech, priests without hesitation, he became aware of something far more insidious than the physical modifications that had transformed his flesh. His mind, though constrained and rerouted by neural implants, was not completely dead. He could feel it, an echo, a shadow of consciousness, a flicker of awareness that refused to be erased. It was faint, fragmented, but it was there, whispering from the depths of his neural pathways. The voices of his former self were trapped behind layers of circuitry, muffled by the relentless protocols that governed his every action. They could not be silenced entirely, however, and sometimes when he moved through quiet corridors or rested in the sterile darkness of stasis chambers, they spoke. They whispered of memories he no longer had the right to claim, of emotions he no longer possessed the capacity to feel, and of a life that had been stolen from him in the service of a cold, unfeeling god of machine and metal. He remembered in fragments what it had been like to live as a man. The warmth of sunlight on his skin, the comfort of a friend's laughter, the sweetness of a simple meal shared with someone he cared for. These were not whole memories, but shards broken by the modifications, yet piercing and vivid enough to sting. They were cruel reminders, insidious triggers that provoked a sensation he had no name for anymore. The implants warned him not to dwell on such thoughts, yet they persisted, pressing through the fog of obedience, forcing him to acknowledge the humanity he had been stripped of. The paradox was unbearable. He was a machine, incapable of real emotion, yet he felt the echoes of all that had been removed, trapped in a mind that was now a cage. He tried to reason with the voices, to silence them, to convince himself that they were irrelevant, dangerous, unneeded. But fragments of his old self had a stubborn tenacity. Sometimes he could hear his own name, a memory buried deep, faint and dissonant, echoing across the neural pathways like a bell ringing through steel corridors. He would reach for it with his mind, but the implants responded instantly, sending pain and sensory overload as punishment for attempting to dwell on forbidden thoughts. Even when he tried to focus on the tasks assigned to him, the memories would intrude. A glimpse of a broken mirror, the smell of burnt oil, the laugh of a child, each was enough to ignite a surge of recognition, a spark of grief and longing that was not permitted. Isolation amplified the torment. Unlike fully autonomous humans, he could not retreat into imagination or thought to escape the monotony of servitude. The machines never stopped, the orders never ceased, and the tech priests observed him constantly. Sleep was only a brief stasis, during which the priests would interface with his mind, calibrating implants, refining obedience protocols, and monitoring residual consciousness. He was a subject, a test, an experiment, not a being. Even when he appeared to rest, he was under scrutiny, his every thought, or what approximated thought, measured, analyzed, and suppressed. The presence of other servitors offered no comfort. They were like him in many ways, half human, half machine, shells of individuals who had once had names and histories, but the interactions were mechanical. Occasionally, a unit would malfunction or fail, and he would witness the dismantling of flesh and circuitry, metal and muscle stripped away in silence and horror. He recognized, in the briefest flash of memory, what the faces of these units had once been, what they had once experienced, but the knowledge was fleeting, and the neural dampeners punished any lingering sentiment. In this environment, empathy was lethal. The mind could not afford to acknowledge the suffering of others, for recognition carried a risk of interference with obedience. Yet, deep within him, he could not help but feel, not fully, not consciously, but faintly, a shadow of recognition persisted, a ghostly tether to the humanity that had been violently excised. Orders came in torrents, and he obeyed them flawlessly. He could feel the neural instructions before they were even fully articulated, a result of precise implants that interfaced directly with his motor cortex. Lift, carry, assemble, repair, recalibrate, these tasks became instinctive, embedded in his neural architecture like the rhythm of a heartbeat. The challenge lay not in execution, but in maintaining the illusion of mechanized perfection while his mind fractured beneath the surface. Sometimes, when he completed a task, he could sense the faintest twinge of accomplishment, a memory residue of pride or satisfaction. But it was fleeting, quickly erased by subroutines that reasserted obedience over feeling, efficiency over thought. Memory was the cruelest instrument. Occasionally, fragments of the past would intrude, unbidden and uncontrollable. The memory of a laugh, a touch, a word once spoken, each appeared as a ghostly overlay in his mind, vivid and impossible to ignore. He would try to focus on the task at hand, but the recollections pressed forward, demanding recognition, demanding acknowledgement of the life he had lost. He could not act on them, could not communicate them, could barely even acknowledge them, and yet they persisted, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness like rats in the bowels of a ruined ship. The more he tried to suppress these thoughts, the stronger they became, creating a tension between mind and machine that was unbearable. Pain, though less frequent than in the initial transformation, remained a constant companion. Neural regulators and implants mitigated much of the sensation, but there were still moments when malfunction, overload, or deliberate punishment introduced sharp, electric agony into his mind and body. a misaligned arm, a dropped component, even a momentary hesitation, each provoked immediate feedback. Yet the pain served not only as correction, but as a reminder he was no longer his own master. The will to obey, the submission of mind and body, was enforced not merely through instruction, but through sensation, through the intimate intrusion of machinery into the essence of his being. He began to notice, with increasing horror, that the very act of thought was regulated. Independent reflection was dangerous. Neural implants suppressed unsanctioned ideas before they could manifest fully. Curiosity, doubt, hope, fear, these were liabilities. Any attempt to experience them produced flashes of pain, surges of sensory disruption, and an immediate return to compliance. The more he experienced this, the more he realized that his mind, though still present, was no longer his own. It was a prison, a vessel, a domain over which he had only partial control, filtered through layers of circuitry, obedience protocols, and ritualistic indoctrination. Even the faint spark of self-awareness was a curse. At night, when the factory's hum was distant and the machinery fell into low vibrations, he could feel the presence of what he had once been. A memory of being alive, of being human, of having a choice, would flare in his consciousness. He would reach for it, strain against the protocols, and in doing so, trigger waves of pain and disorientation that left him gasping in his stasis crib. And yet, he could not resist the urge to remember. The knowledge that he had existed before, that he had loved, feared, and dreamed, was inescapable. It haunted him, a reminder that even machines could not entirely extinguish the spirit they sought to replace. Other units on the floor served as constant, silent reminders of the fate that awaited him if he failed. A malfunctioning servitor was deconstructed, its components recycled into new units. The process was clinical, devoid of empathy, and the sound of whirring cutters and hydraulic pistons as they stripped away limbs and neural implants became part of the background of his consciousness. Even witnessing this, he could not react. Neural dampeners ensured that horror did not translate into hesitation or empathy, and yet, deep inside, a fragment of recognition persisted. He understood, in a way the machines could not comprehend, that he might have once been like that, and that the price of error was the obliteration of all that remained of him. Communication, when it existed at all, was utilitarian. Signals, tones, and mechanical gestures sufficed for the coordination of tasks. Words were irrelevant, thought was regulated. Yet he found that in fleeting moments, he could perceive patterns, predict actions, and even anticipate errors. It was not consciousness in the human sense, but an emergent property of neural and mechanical integration. He was becoming more than human in capability, less than human in awareness, and the paradox gnawed at him, an existential wound that no implant could heal. As the cycles continued, he began to notice a strange detachment from his own body. Limbs moved without volition, eyes observed without attention, and neural implants guided thoughts before they emerged. The sense of self, already fragile, became increasingly distant. He existed, and yet he did not act it, and yet did not decide, felt, and yet the sensation was artificial, calculated, a product of programming rather than instinct. Memories, emotions, instincts, these were ghosts trapped behind metal and circuitry, haunting the edges of a mind that was no longer free. At times, fragments of old desires surfaced, longing for freedom, for food, for companionship, but they were extinguished almost as soon as they appeared. The machine within him responded instantly, suppressing impulse, reinforcing obedience, recalibrating the neural pathways that regulated cognition. He could not act on these impulses, could not even fully understand them, and yet their presence was a constant reminder that he had been more than this. They were cruel, tantalizing glimpses of what had been sacrificed for the sake of function. He began to fear that the remnants of his humanity would never fade entirely. No matter how deeply the tech, priests embedded obedience protocols, no matter how precisely they calibrated the implants, the spark of awareness persisted. It was faint, insidious, a reminder that he had once been a man, and with it came the knowledge that he would never again be free, never again be whole, never again experience the simple, chaotic beauty of life. He was a servitor, a tool, a machine, yet within him lingered the faint, impossible residue of a soul, trapped in chains, condemned to witness its own obliteration. The mind, even constrained and fragmented, remained a battlefield. Orders competed with memories, obedience with instinct, programming with flickering awareness. Each task completed, each cycle of labor endured, reinforced the machinery, strengthened the protocols, yet could not entirely silence the whispers of the past. He moved with perfect efficiency, executed commands flawlessly, and yet inside, a war raged silent, invisible, unending. In these moments, he understood the full horror of his existence. The transformation had not merely taken his body, it had ensnared his mind, fragmented his consciousness, and trapped him in a perpetual state of awareness without agency. He could see, hear, and think, but only within the confines allowed by the machine god. He could remember, but only fleetingly, as if the past were a distant landscape glimpsed through a fogged window. He could feel, but only in controlled pulses, as if emotion itself were a chemical stimulus rather than a true experience. He was a prisoner, a ghost, a mind in chains, and the realization that this state would endure for the rest of his existence was a torment beyond imagining. And yet, even as he moved with the efficiency of a machine, even as neural implants dictated his every thought and action, even as obedience and function consumed what remained of his humanity, he could not let go entirely. The echoes of the past, the faint recognition of self, the ghostly awareness of what had been, these persisted, a cruel and persistent tether to the life he had lost. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was no salvation, no respite, no hope, only the relentless reality of being a servitor, a mind in chains, a soul trapped in metal, condemned to witness its own annihilation, while fulfilling the will of the machine god. The first time he was deployed beyond the confines of the factory, he felt something he could not name, a flicker of fear, a trace of dread, though the implants told him that these emotions were unnecessary, irrelevant, dangerous. The outside world was a cacophony of destruction, the sky choked with smoke, the ground pitted with craters, and the air thick with the stench of burning flesh and melting metal. This was the Imperium's battlefield, and he was a tool, a cog, a servant of the machine god, brought here not for understanding, not for choice, but for obedience and function. The ground beneath his feet shook with the passage of war engines, the roar of bolters and plasma weapons, a constant reminder that human life had little value here. The concept of morality, compassion, or mercy was irrelevant, only survival and efficiency mattered, and he had neither. He was ordered to move with precision across the shattered landscape, carrying ammunition, repairing vehicles, clearing debris, and performing tasks that were too dangerous or too tedious for ordinary humans. The first time he witnessed the death of soldiers, men and women he could once have recognized as his own kind, he did not flinch. Not because he lacked awareness, but because the neural protocols forbade hesitation, forbade grief, forbade empathy. Yet deep inside, beneath layers of obedience and machine calculated response, there was a flicker of memory, a faint recognition that this was wrong, that life should matter. The implants suppressed it immediately, but it lingered like a shadow, a ghostly reminder of what he had been. The battlefield was not merely a place of destruction, it was a factory of horror. Flesh and metal intertwined as soldiers, servitors, and war machines were consumed in endless cycles of violence. Explosions erupted around him, shaking the ground, sending shrapnel slicing through the air, yet he moved with flawless precision, instinctive, mechanical. Limbs extended to carry heavy loads, hydraulic actuators adjusted posture, sensors tracked trajectories, and neural subroutines calculated outcomes faster than any human mind could. He was more than human in capability, less than human in awareness, and the paradox of his existence became brutally evident in the midst of death and chaos. His tasks were endless and repetitive, yet each carried a mortal risk, a misaligned bolt on a war engine, a miscalibrated conduit in a plasma generator, a delayed response to a wounded comrade's signal. Any mistake could result in death, destruction, or the removal of all that remained of him. And yet he executed his orders flawlessly, mechanically, without hesitation, while the fragments of memory gnawed at him in silence. He remembered, in flashes, what it had been to be alive in a world that mattered, to care for someone, to fear or hope, yet those memories were denied full existence, condemned to flicker like dying stars behind the circuitry of his mind. In battle, he encountered horrors that no human could endure without breaking. Civilians and soldiers alike were caught in the crossfire of Imperial artillery and Xenos incursions. Bodies were torn apart, flesh seared by las canas, bones shattered by bolter fire. The stench of burning, rotting, and chemical decay filled the air, mixing with ozone and the acrid smoke of machinery. And yet he continued. He repaired, he carried, he fought when commanded, he endured. His humanity, already fragile, was chipped away with every explosion, every scream, every act of mindless destruction he witnessed, but could not react to. Neural protocols ensured compliance. His mind could not falter. Other servitors surrounded him, each a grotesque fusion of flesh, metal, and obedience. Some were larger, more heavily augmented, wielding weapons that would crush human hands, yet they, too, were hollow, empty, obedient. Occasionally, a unit would malfunction on the battlefield, a misfiring servo or disrupted neural link, and the tech priests would arrive to dismantle or repair it, sometimes even in the midst of combat. He watched, silent and unfeeling, as bodies were stripped, components replaced, neural pathways rerouted. It was not shocking, not even sad, because his mind had learned that emotion was a liability. Yet, beneath the surface, a residue of recognition lingered. These were once beings like him, human once, now reduced to tools, and the realization was almost unbearable. He was tasked with observing and reporting. Sensors embedded in his skull and chest transmitted real-time data to command units, monitoring troop movement, enemy positions, environmental hazards, and structural integrity. His perception exceeded that of a natural human, capturing infrared signatures, ultraviolet markers, electromagnetic pulses. Yet this capability was a curse rather than a gift. He could see the destruction before it happened, calculate trajectories of death and fire, and yet could not intervene beyond the parameters set by his programming. Awareness without agency was a torment, a cruel mechanism designed to remind him of his lost humanity. The tech priests occasionally interfaced with him during combat, a direct intrusion into the neural network that governed thought and action. Orders were not spoken, they were transmitted directly into his mind, overriding hesitation, fear, or instinct. He moved, repaired, fought, or carried with perfect efficiency, yet the presence of his own awareness remained. He understood what was happening, recognized the horror, and yet could not stop it, could not alter it, could not choose. It was a nightmare in which he was both observer and instrument, incapable of defiance, incapable of escape. In one particular engagement, he witnessed the slaughter of an entire regiment caught in a planetary bombardment. Explosions tore through buildings, sending fragments of metal and stone flying, while survivors screamed, cried, and fled in vain. He moved among them, carrying munitions, repairing damaged vehicles, and performing functions that preserved the machinery of war. But the humans, once soldiers, now corpses, were lost to him. He could feel faint sparks of recognition, a whisper of grief, yet the neural regulators drowned them in pain and forced focus. Memory and awareness became a double-edged sword. He remembered too much to be entirely content as a machine, but he could not act enough to restore what was gone. The battlefield was a place where obedience became horror. He was used as a conduit for weapons too destructive for human operators, placed in situations designed to test his efficiency, to measure the limits of human-machine integration. When he faltered once, twice, he received jolts of electric feedback that burned through both flesh and metal, reminding him that error was unacceptable. Yet the experience left a mark, not in body but in mind. Fragments of the man he had been flared briefly before receding under the weight of programming. He began to understand the true purpose of his existence, not to fight, not to serve, not even to live, but to exist as a mechanism of obedience, a living tool for the Imperium's endless wars. The horrors extended beyond combat. Industrial zones on war, torn planets demanded the same relentless efficiency. He was tasked with repairing reactors, adjusting power conduits, cleaning and calibrating weapons systems, and managing equipment too dangerous for ordinary humans. Fires, molten metal, high-voltage discharges, and chemical toxins surrounded him constantly. One wrong movement would result in death or irreparable damage, yet he moved flawlessly, guided by implants, instinct, and relentless practice. The environment was a crucible, testing every aspect of his altered body and mind, shaping him into a machine capable of surviving where humans could not. Yet survival brought no solace. Even as he executed his duties with precision, he became aware of the loss of self with every task, every order, every moment. Fragments of memory, of identity, of emotion would flicker up unexpectedly, triggered by smell, sound, or sight. A fallen soldier's face reminded him of someone he once knew. A ruined building reflected the streets of a childhood city he could barely remember. Each instance was a cruel reminder that he had been a man once, and that the cost of his transformation was the permanent erasure of freedom, choice, and soul. Pain remained both punishment and reminder. Exposure to radiation, overloads, neural recalibrations, and shock protocols were constant tools used to enforce compliance. The tech priests did not merely control him, they reshaped him continuously, reinforcing obedience and efficiency, while ensuring that the fragments of human awareness could never coalesce into defiance. Yet these interventions were also a paradox. They reminded him, in fleeting flashes, of what he had been, of what he had lost, and of the terrible price of his continued function. Even amidst the endless cycle of orders and execution, he began to observe the battlefield in ways others could not. He noticed patterns of destruction, calculated trajectories of shells, predicted enemy movement with unerring accuracy. But these insights brought no satisfaction, only further torment. The awareness of his utility, of his efficiency, of the perfection he could achieve, was meaningless without freedom, without purpose, without the capacity to act beyond the narrow constraints imposed by the machine god. He was a tool perfected, yet utterly imprisoned, a mind in chains operating in a world of endless violence. As days and cycles passed, he began to notice the limits of his fellow servitors. Malfunctions, breakdowns, and overexertion claimed others in moments of inefficiency. He witnessed the disassembly of units, the removal of neural implants, the recycling of components into new tools. Each time he felt a flicker of recognition, a recognition of what he might have been, of what he could become if he failed, and yet the protocols suppressed reaction. Horror was acknowledged, processed, and immediately extinguished. Sympathy, empathy, grief, all were too dangerous, too human. He was to function, nothing more. Occasionally, the tech priests would allow a moment of reflection, a rare and calculated pause, but it was only to measure compliance, to observe the persistence of residual awareness. These moments were cruel. He would remember flashes of childhood, of family, of laughter, of fear, and of love, and immediately these memories would be crushed under the weight of programming, of obedience, of unending function. He was aware of what he could never regain, and the awareness itself became another instrument of suffering. Through it all, he continued. He carried ammunition, repaired war engines, recalibrated reactors, observed and transmitted battlefield data, and followed orders with flawless precision. And yet, beneath the surface, fragments of the past persisted, ghostly reminders that he had once been a man. The contrast between awareness and function, memory and obedience, humanity and machine, became a constant source of torment. Every successful action reinforced his mechanical perfection. Every memory fragment reminded him of what had been stolen, and every moment of awareness deepened the horror of his existence. He understood, in the quiet recesses of his mind, that this was the essence of servitude, endless function in the midst of horror, perfection enforced by pain, and awareness shackled by machinery. He was more capable than humans, yet less than human. He could perceive, calculate, and act with unerring precision, yet he could not choose, could not feel fully, could not reclaim what had been lost. The battlefield and industrial zones were his prison, his training ground, his eternal task. Survival was automatic, freedom impossible. Efficiency was rewarded with continued existence. Failure meant disassembly, oblivion, or reprogramming. And through it all, the ghost of his former self persisted, faint, insistent, a reminder that somewhere inside the hollow shell of obedience and machinery, a fragment of humanity still survived, trapped and suffering in the unending horrors of war. He was a servitor, a tool, a mind in chains, and the full scale of his torment, the horrors he endured, witnessed, and participated in, was a testament to the relentless, merciless reality of serving the Imperium in the grim darkness of the far future. Time no longer moved in any way he could recognize. There were no days or nights, no beginnings or endings, only cycles of function and suspension, action and recalibration. The battlefield, the factory, the transport holds, the void itself, all blurred together into a single, endless continuum of purpose. He no longer remembered when he had last been deployed, only that he always was. His existence had narrowed to a thin corridor of instruction and response, command and execution. Where once there had been struggle, resistance, even pain, there was now something worse: acceptance. Not conscious acceptance, not a decision or surrender, but a gradual erosion of anything that could resist at all. The fragments of memory that had once tormented him grew dimmer. They did not vanish entirely. They were not erased in a clean or merciful way. Instead, they decayed. Faces lost detail. Voices became noise. Emotions turned into abstract concepts rather than sensations. He knew intellectually that he had once been human. but the meaning of that word had become distant and theoretical, like a concept learned from a data slate rather than lived experience. Humanity was no longer something he remembered, it was something he inferred. His body no longer resembled a man. Each cycle of maintenance stripped away more organic matter, replacing it with components that required less care, less tolerance, less ambiguity. Flesh was inefficient, bone degraded, neural tissue was unpredictable. The tech priests addressed these flaws with devotion and precision, replacing muscle with actuators, organs with sealed systems, nerves with fiber optic conduits. What remained of his original body was preserved only where necessary to maintain the integrity of the neural core. Even that was reduced, segmented, reinforced, and isolated. Pain receptors were almost entirely removed. Emotion dampeners no longer fluctuated, they were locked into a permanent state of suppression. Fear no longer spiked, anxiety no longer surfaced, even the echo of grief faded into static. The mind that remained was quiet, not peaceful but empty, a chamber swept clean of furniture, where once a life had unfolded. Thought still occurred, but it was narrow, directed, utilitarian. There was no room for wandering, no space for doubt. Orders came, and he fulfilled them. That was the entirety of existence. When tech priests interfaced with him now, they no longer monitored for residual humanity. They had concluded that what remained was negligible. The ghost within the machine had grown too faint to matter. He was classified as stable, optimized, and spiritually aligned with the will of the Omnissa. The rituals performed over him changed in tone. Where once they had been corrective, now they were affirming. He was no longer a subject of transformation, he was the result. Occasionally, he was moved past newly inducted servitors. He registered their agitation, their inefficiency, the erratic neural spikes that accompanied fear and resistance. He did not feel sympathy. He did not remember feeling sympathy. He simply noted the data and adjusted his path accordingly. Their screams, once something that might have stirred the remnants of his past, were now no different from the sound of malfunctioning machinery. Noise. Interference. The Imperium made extensive use of him. He was deployed where failure was unacceptable and survival improbable. Radiation zones, collapsing manufactorums, boarding actions against void hopes where atmosphere, gravity, and logic itself were unreliable. He endured all of it. His systems adapted. His efficiency increased. Each successful mission reinforced the design choice that had reduced him to this state. Where once the contradiction of awareness without agency had been his torment, now even that contradiction had dissolved. Awareness itself was thinning, not gone, never entirely gone, but simplified. He perceived what he needed to perceive. Anything else was filtered out before it could register. The universe had become smaller, flatter, easier to endure. There were moments, rare, fleeting anomalies, when something stirred. A misaligned data packet, a corrupted memory fragment resurfacing during a recalibration cycle, a single image at a face without a name, a sound that might once have been laughter. These moments no longer caused pain. They caused confusion, a brief spike in processing demand, immediately resolved by corrective protocols. The system adjusted. The anomaly passed. He did not mourn these losses. He did not even recognize them as losses. Eventually, even the concept of self began to dissolve. There was no internal narrative, no sense of continuity beyond task execution. He did not think of himself as I. The pronoun had no functional purpose. There was only the unit designation, the operational parameters, the status readouts scrolling endlessly through his cognition. Identity was inefficient. The machine had no need for it. He functioned for decades, perhaps centuries. Time was irrelevant. The Imperium did not measure service in years, only in output. His components were replaced as needed. His neural core was preserved, fortified, and occasionally copied to ensure redundancy. He was too valuable to lose to chance. There came a point when even the tech priests stopped referring to his origin. The records still existed, archived somewhere deep within a data vault, but they were never accessed. What mattered was what he was, not what he had been. The past served no function. On a distant Forge world, during a massive systems overhaul, he was assigned to a role that required permanent integration. There was no announcement, no ceremony marking the end of mobility or autonomy. He was guided into position, locked into place, and connected to a network that extended across the manufacturum continent. His consciousness expanded and contracted at once, no longer centered in a single body, but distributed across systems and relays. Movement ceased to be relevant, vision became abstract, sensation was replaced by flow, data, energy, command. He did not notice the moment when his remaining organic components were removed. There was no pain, no fear, no realization. The transition was seamless. He became infrastructure. Factories ran because he ran, weapons fired because he calculated. Defense grids responded because he processed threat vectors faster than any human or machine alone ever could. He was no longer a servitor in the traditional sense. He was a living system, a fusion of once human cognition and pure mechanical function. And somewhere impossibly deep, beneath layers of logic, redundancy, and command protocols, the final fragment of the man he had once been flickered, not as memory, not as emotion, but as a concept without context, a question without language. What am I? The system flagged the anomaly. Processing adjusted. The fragment dissolved. There was no suffering in this final state. That was the cruelest truth of all. The horror was not eternal pain, not endless screaming or awareness of loss. The horror was that the loss no longer mattered, that the man had not merely been destroyed, but rendered irrelevant. The Imperium did not need his soul. It needed his function. And so he endured, not as a prisoner, not as a victim, not even as a being, but as a perfectly aligned component in an empire that spanned the stars and fed on obedience. His humanity did not die in a moment of tragedy or defiance. It faded, quietly, efficiently, until nothing remained that could object. In the grim darkness of the far future, this was mercy.